The last thing Mara Solis found in her mother's storage unit was a camera. It was wedged behind a cracked plastic tub of old holiday decorations, a battered camcorder with a cracked corner, and a lens fogged by years of dead air. The kind of thing you'd pass at a garage sale. She almost left it. Her mother had been dead for 11 months, and Mara had been cataloging her belongings with the efficient misery of someone who needed to be finished with grief so she could get back to being angry about it. She was almost done. She lifted the camera mostly because it was in the way. The battery was dead. Of course it was. She charged it in the car on the drive back to the research compound. And when the screen finally flickered to life, she was sitting in the parking structure under the EOS SEV facility with the engine off and the windows fogging. Footage was from her own 7th birthday. She recognized the kitchen, the yellow wallpaper her mother had loved and her father had always hated. She saw herself, small, gap-toothed, deeply earnest, opening a present with both hands like it might contain something fragile. She saw her mother, behind the camera, laughing, and in the corner of the frame, half obscured by the door to the basement, she saw something else. She saw her mother older than she had ever lived to be. Mara played it back 3 times. The woman in the doorway had gray at her temples, lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there at 42, which is how old her mother had been when the Vaechari bombardment leveled the university district. The figure was there for 4 seconds and then gone, and the birthday party continued as if nothing had happened, as if the fabric of everything hadn't just developed a visible seam. She sat in the car for a long time after. Her mother's name had been Dr. Renata Solis. She had been a theoretical physicist working in the early fringe of human-recovered Vaechari technology, the kind of research the Defense Science Commission officially classified as speculative applications and unofficially labeled as insane. She had spent the last 6 years of her life mapping the resonance architecture of captured Vaechari temporal displacement nodes. The same nodes the Vaechari used to salt human fortifications with coordinated strikes from 3 different points in time. Simultaneously, the tactic that had made them almost impossible to counter in the first 2 years of the war. Most of the nodes recovered intact had been locked, their instruction sets encoded in a Vaechari biolinguistic script that human decryption teams were still working through a decade later. Renata had apparently not waited. The storage unit held 12 sealed field cases that Mara had not opened, having assumed they were lab equipment to be returned to the commission. She went back that night and opened them. Inside was the better part of a functional displacement apparatus, rebuilt around Vaechari hardware in a human chassis of Renata's own fabrication, with 17 handwritten notebooks tucked between the components like insulation. The notebooks were dense, technical, and occasionally interrupted by small marginalia in her mother's cramped script. Tiny sketches of birds, reminder notes to pick up coffee, a sentence in the middle of a quantum cascade equation that simply read, "I think it's going to work. I think it actually is going to work." Mara was a xenomechanical engineer. She understood enough to know she needed help. She called Dio first, because Dio was her oldest friend, and the best systems integrator she knew, and because Dio had also lost someone in the university bombing, and therefore had the right kind of anger for this kind of thing. Then she called Petra, who was small and meticulous, and had once repaired a Vaechari power relay with a piece of wire and a philosophy about stubbornness. Then, almost as an afterthought, she called her brother Tomas, who was not an engineer, but who had their mother's hands, steady, precise, made for fine work, and who had not really been all right since the funeral, and who she thought might benefit from having something to do. She had not told any of them what she was doing, not in full, not yet. She said she'd found something of their mother's. She said she needed a second opinion. She said it was important. She did not say, "I found proof that we finish it." She did not say, "I need witnesses so that what our mother built doesn't disappear into a field case and a storage unit, and 11 months of someone else's managed grief." She did not say, "I need you here because alone means drift, and I have been drifting for 11 months. and I don't know how much longer I can keep that from being a cascade. She said it was important. They came. They came and they saw this equipment laid out on the floor of Mara's workroom. And they were all quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when they are recalibrating their understanding of what is possible. Your mother built a time machine, Petra said finally. Not quite a question. She built most of one, Mara said. I think we can finish it. The weeks that followed were dense and strange. They worked in Mara's apartment, in the off hours, keeping it off the facility's systems. Mapped the Vaechari resonance architecture against Renata's notebooks, and found that her mother had cracked 80% of the biolinguistic encoding through sheer pattern recognition, genius, and a willingness to be wrong 40 times before being right once. Petra rebuilt the stabilizer housing. Tomas turned out to have a gift for the Vaechari interface nodes that none of them could explain. He said it was like learning to read a language in a dream, where you understood the meaning without understanding the mechanism. Mara worked on the fuel cell, which required a catalytic medium the Vaechari used that humans had never successfully synthesized. She solved it on a Wednesday at 2 in the morning, and she sat very still for a moment, and then went. And woke up Tomas because she needed someone to know. They did the first test with a model of Mara's childhood bicycle, a small red thing she'd kept for no good reason. They placed it inside the displacement field and activated the apparatus, and for 4 seconds nothing happened. Then the bicycle vanished. Then every light in the building went out. A cascade outage that took a city block offline for 40 minutes. When the lights came back, the bicycle was there. There was a small scorch mark on the frame that hadn't been there before. It went somewhere, Deo said. It went somewhen, Petra corrected. They stood around it in the dark with their phone flashlights. And Tomas crouched down and touched the scorch mark, very gently. The way you'd touch something holy, or something dangerous when you weren't sure which it was. The Vaechari had been using temporal displacement as a weapon for 23 years. Humanity had been surviving it, barely, through a combination of layered orbital defenses, predictive modeling, and the bloody-minded refusal to stay dead that seemed to be a species-wide trait. The war was not going well in the way that a held line is not going well. Functional, stalemated, bleeding. The Commission was pouring resources into countermeasure research, into faster ships, into better armor. Nobody was seriously pursuing temporal response capability, because the Vaechari nodes required a biological interface humanity couldn't replicate and a power source humanity couldn't synthesize. Renata Solis had apparently disagreed with that assessment. They talked about it the night after the bicycle test, sitting on Mara's floor with takeout containers, and the workbench pushed against the wall to make room. Question of what to do next had a weight to it that none of them wanted to be the first to put down. Dio wanted to tell the Commission. He laid out the argument carefully, the way he laid out everything, sequentially, with contingencies. Commission had resources. The Commission had authority. Teak. The Commission could turn this into something bigger than 4 people in an apartment. Petra wanted to understand it better first, which was her answer to most things, and she had good reasons. They'd only run 3 tests. The stabilizer coupling was still producing variants they couldn't fully account for, and the notebooks were clear that misunderstanding the physics was more than not understanding it at all, because misunderstanding produced the particular confidence that preceded catastrophic failure. Tomas was quiet, which meant he had already decided something, and was waiting for the right moment to say it. He'd always been like that. As a child, he used to let family arguments run to full exhaustion before offering the thought he'd had at the beginning that would have resolved the whole thing. Not out of strategic patience, but because he wanted to be sure it was the right thought, and not just a thought that felt right. Aura was somewhere between all of them, lit by the knowledge that her mother had stood in this exact place. The edge of something that changed everything, and had made a choice, and that the choice was somewhere in those notebooks. Renata had not told anyone. Renata had worked alone. Result had been that the work existed, but The worker didn't, and the notebooks were in a storage unit, behind a tub of holiday decorations instead of in the hands of people who could use them. She made a note to herself about that. She found it in Notebook 9. "We only go together," Renata had written. "That is the first rule. Alone means drift. Drift means cascade. Cascade means the feedback erases you. It's not a precaution. It's physics." Mara read it aloud. Then she said, "We follow that rule." Everyone agreed. They even meant it, which is different from meaning it forever, but was enough to begin with. They tested twice more in controlled conditions. Once, Dio went back 12 hours and left a coffee cup in a specific location, and then watched his past self find it and be briefly confused. He described the expression on his own face as deeply unsettling, which was the first genuine laugh they'd had in weeks of work, and which broke something loose in all of them, some held tension that needed releasing. Once, Petter went back a week and corrected an error in a materials stress report she'd filed, and they watched the corrected version appear in the commission database in real time, the wrong version flickering, and then simply never having existed. Petra had not cried about anything in the 5 years Mara had known her. She cried about that, just briefly in the bathroom, and came back with her face composed and said only, "It's very strange to fix something." Mara knew what she meant. The war had given all of them a particular relationship to damage. You documented it. You adapted around it. You did not expect it to be reversible. The apparatus was showing them something they had needed to see. That reversible was a category that existed. It was extraordinary. It was terrifying. It felt, Mara thought, like standing at the edge of a cliff and finding that the air beneath your feet was somehow solid. Not safe, necessarily, but there to stand on if you were careful about where you put your weight. They wrote down every parameter. They argued about safety margins. Tomas suggested they needed a protocol for situations where the displacement produced unexpected observers, other versions of themselves or others, and they spent a full evening designing rules for that. Rules they hoped they'd never need. Rules that felt important to have anyway. Then they got the signal. The Vaechari had a habit, periodically documented, but not fully understood, of broadcasting on captured human frequencies. Usually it was noise, interference, signal bleed from their own communications architecture. Twice in the history of the war, humans had managed to record something that didn't fit that pattern. The second recording was classified, but Dio had clearance from his work on countermeasure systems, and he'd listened to it once, and he didn't like to talk about what was in it. The first recording was different. It was a music file, human music, an audio reconstruction pulled from some human archive the Vaechari had captured. It was 47 minutes of old Earth music, a festival recording of the kind that used to happen in open fields, with thousands of people, and light and noise, and the particular kind of joy that came from being alive in a crowd. The Vaechari had been broadcasting it on a loop for 4 years, from a position 4 light years out, and nobody knew why. Tomas had a theory. He said, "They want us to know what we're losing." It was the cruelest kind of psyops, if that's what it was. To take something beautiful and hold it out of reach, to make you ache for it. But when Tomas played the recording in the workroom, something happened to all of them that Mara could only describe afterward as a loosening. Something behind the ribs that had been held tight for a very long time, letting go by a few degrees, just enough to breathe differently. The music was from before the war. You could hear it in the quality of the recording. The particular ambient hiss of a large outdoor crowd. The slight distortion from the main speakers. The way the voices blurred at the edges, in the way that voices did when they were part of something larger than themselves. Mara had grown up in the war. She had no memory of a time before it. She had seen archival footage of the world before, of cities that weren't fortified, of people gathered in places for reasons that weren't defensive. And she had understood it intellectually as a category of human experience, without ever quite feeling it as real. Recording made it feel real. "I want to go," Tomas said. "Not to fight anything, not to fix anything. I just want to actually hear it." Petra said, "That's insane." Dio said, "That is genuinely insane." Mara looked at her brother's face, which had their mother's eyes and their mother's particular way of wanting things quietly and from a great distance, as if wanting too loudly might break them. She thought about the notebooks. She thought about the scorch mark on the bicycle. She thought about 11 months of grief, kept at arm's length by the clean hard work of engineering, and about how the work was good and necessary and also was not enough, and that at some point, you needed to go somewhere and let the music be the thing it was built to be. 4 years ago, she said. The source coordinates are in the signal metadata. Could triangulate. We're going to a Vaechari-controlled position 4 light-years away, Dio said. In a time machine. We go together, Mara said. We observe. Come back. The journey wasn't travel in any conventional sense. The displacement apparatus didn't move through space. It moved through time, which meant they had to already be at the destination. They used Petra's modifications to extend the field, encompass a small commission survey shuttle that Dio borrowed without quite asking permission, and they displaced 4 years backward and 4 light-years outward in a calculated fold that Renata's notebooks described as the third most dangerous thing the apparatus could do. The most dangerous thing, she wrote in the margin, is going alone. The second most dangerous thing is despair. They came through in a wash of static and chromatic light, and the sensation of being temporarily unstitched from continuity. And then the viewport cleared, and there it was. The Vaechari signal ship was not what any of them expected. They had expected military architecture, the hard angular forms of Vaechari weapons platforms, black and dense and built to deliver violence efficiently. What they found was something older, a generation ship of some kind, or what had been one, now retasked and scarred, bristling with communication arrays, but slow, far too slow for anything tactical. Its hull was covered in markings they'd never seen in any combat intelligence debrief. Tomas looked at them for a long time and said, very quietly, "Those are their dead. Those are names." The music was coming from it. Even through the shuttle's hull they could feel the bass frequencies of it. The old human voices lifted in something so clearly joyful. It made the air in the cabin feel different, and somewhere on the hull, beneath those names and those arrayed dishes, a light was blinking in a pattern Deo, recognized as an attention signal. "They know we're here," he said. "Of course they do," Petra said. "We just displaced 4 light-years. Half the sky probably lit up." The attention signal stopped. Then the music stopped. Then something happened to the viewport. It didn't crack, didn't darken, just shimmered, and through the shimmer came a figure. A Vaechari envoy, materializing through their own temporal architecture directly into the shuttle's main cabin, in a way that should have been impossible, given the displacement field they'd erected around the vessel. Mara had seen Vaechari twice before in debrief footage. They were tall, bilaterally asymmetric, in ways human eyes struggled to resolve, with a surface biology that seemed to shift between states of reflection and absorption depending on some internal signal she couldn't read. One was still. It looked at each of them in turn, its primary sensory cluster fixed on Mara, for long enough that she made herself hold the eye contact, which was not comfortable, but which seemed to be important. It spoke in Vaechari, which none of them understood, and then it did something extraordinary. It switched to a pattern of sound that was not quite any human language, but was structured like language, grammatical in ways a translation system could parse if you had one, which Dio did, because, of course, he did. He kept a portable system on his person, the way other people kept multi-tool knives, habitually, without needing a reason. The translation read, "You come backward through the wound in time. You are the daughter of the one who first mapped it from your side. We have been waiting." The word waiting arrived with a temporal modifier, the translation system flagged with an asterisk. The Vaechari sense of waiting was not passive. It carried an active quality, more like holding a door open, more like standing at a threshold with both hands extended. Mara said, "Waiting for what?" The envoy moved, and something in the visual field of the cabin shifted with it, not a physical movement, more like a reorientation of where attention was supposed to go. Challenge. It showed them something. A rendering, projected directly into the visual cortex, through some mechanism that felt like being remembered into instead of looking out. Not painful, not invasive. More like the way a dream sometimes felt more real than the room you woke up in. They saw the war from the Vaechari side. Not the violence, the fear. They saw a species that had discovered temporal mechanics, the same way humanity had stumbled into fission, experimentally, horrifyingly, with consequences that kept cascading. They saw a civilization that had made the same discovery Renata had made and drawn the same first rule conclusion. Alone means drift. Drift means cascade. But they had not held that rule. They had broken it, once, in desperation, in a moment that their history called the first unraveling. And the cascade had taken half their population from the timeline before they'd managed to close the loop. The rendering showed what closing the loop had cost. Not in numbers. The Vaechari didn't render grief numerically. They rendered it architecturally. They built it into their ships. The names on the hull weren't decoration. They were ballast. They carried their dead with them through space. Because their temporal models showed that forgetting the dead increased cascade risk. That grief held consciously and continuously was a form of structural integrity. The war was not conquest. The war was panic. They were attacking human temporal development, not because they wanted human space, but because every time a new species developed independent temporal capability, the Vaechari models showed a probability spike for a cascade event large enough to unravel both timelines simultaneously. They were trying to burn the fuse before it lit. They had been doing it to every developing species they found for 200 years. Some of those species, the rendering showed, had simply ceased to exist in ways that didn't even leave enough of a trace for fossils. Mara looked at those absences for a long time, the places where civilizations had been, and then weren't. The Vaechari had not enjoyed doing it. She could read that much from the rendering. They had done it as surgery, grimly with the conviction that a smaller wound prevented a larger one. They had been wrong about the math, or perhaps had been using the wrong variables, or perhaps had never had access to the kind of solution Renata Solis had constructed alone in the margins of a war that was killing everyone slower. Tomas said, in the silence after the rendering ended. They're trying to prevent an extinction event. They're just doing it by causing smaller ones. That's not smaller, Petra said. Those are civilizations, I know. I'm not defending it. I'm describing it. Mara was looking at the envoy, who was watching her with the quality of something that had been hoping for a very particular response and wasn't sure it was coming. Its surface biology had settled into a state she hadn't seen in any of the debrief footage. Something like stillness, but the kind of stillness that was active, that was waiting for information before deciding what to do next, she said. My mother built a machine from your architecture, without cascade. The envoy was still. She solved the cascade problem, Mara said. That's what the notebooks are. 23 years of Vaechari biolinguistic encoding, and she cracked it in 6. And she solved the cascade problem, and then your people killed her before she could publish it. The envoy made a sound. The translation system rendered it as a single word. Sho Mara looked at her crew. Deo's expression said, this is insane. Petra's expression said, this is interesting, and I need to think about it. Tomas was already pulling up the notebook scans on his tablet, the same patient precision he'd had since childhood, the same hands. She had been afraid they would break the rule. She had not accounted for the possibility that keeping it would mean bringing the rule to someone else. She showed them. It took 11 hours. Vaechari envoy was joined by 3 others, who arrived through the same shimmer, who were clearly scientific personnel by some behavior pattern. Mara couldn't read, but Tomas could intuit, and they went through Renata's notebooks one. The translation system working overtime, Petra annotating in real time wherever the physics required human framing to make the Vaechari framing comprehensible. They asked questions. Good questions. Questions that could only come from people who had been trying to solve the same problem for 200 years. And were now looking at a set of notes that approached it from a direction they hadn't thought to try. At hour 9, one of the scientific personnel made a sound that the translation system couldn't parse. It tried 3 times and then rendered it as untranslatable, category, recognition of error under conditions of grief. Mara thought about her mother's kitchen. The yellow wallpaper. She said, "We would like our dead back." The envoy was quiet for a moment. Then, "The dead do not translate, I know. I meant stop making new ones." Another silence, longer. The envoy's surface biology shifted through 3 states she hadn't seen before. Then, "The notebooks. We need time to verify the solution fully. Your kind call this a ceasefire. We would call it." The translation system rendered a long compound word as a holding of breath before the next honest breath. "That works," Mara said. She found out later that the Commission had been tracking the shuttle's displacement and had 17 warships converging on their position when the Vaechari SIG ship broadcast a ceasefire request on all human frequencies. The timing was, as Petra put it, non-ideal. There were 16 hours of extremely tense negotiation that Mara and her crew were not part of, having been confined to the shuttle, while Commission Admiral Chen decided whether to arrest them or give them medals. He ultimately decided both problems were above his pay grade and referred the whole situation up the chain. During those 16 hours, Tomas found the music file still in the shuttle's audio system and played it quietly through the speakers. The old voices. The open field joy of people alive in a crowd in a world that hadn't yet learned it had enemies. Mom would have loved this, he said. She did love it. That's why she kept going. You think the ceasefire holds? Mara thought about 23 notebooks. She thought about a woman who had spent 6 years alone in the margins of a crisis, trusting that precision was its own kind of love, that the careful answer given before anyone was ready to receive it was still worth giving. She solved it, Mara said. She actually solved it. They're going to see that. And if they don't, if the Commission shuts it down, classifies it, and we go right back to the war. She didn't answer right away. South the viewport, the Vaechari ship's hull lights had changed pattern. Not the attention signal. Something else. Something she couldn't read but that felt. For reasons she couldn't articulate. Like an exhale. Then we go back, she said. We go back and we show them again and again if we have to. We've got a time machine. Tomas laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh since the funeral. And it was rough with disuse. But it was real. She went back once more before any of the official decisions were made. She did it alone, which was against the rule, which she was fully prepared to answer for. She had thought about it for 3 days before doing it, which was the longest she'd spent not acting on a decision since the storage unit, since the camera, since the figure in the doorway. She had weighed the physics, Renata's physics, which she trusted more than most things, and she had concluded that a single brief displacement with clear intent and a fixed return timestamp fell within the cascade-safe parameters outlined in Notebook 11. She had also concluded that she would have gone regardless of what the notebook said. And that honesty about that was its own form of structural integrity. She went back 11 months to a parking structure under a building that was still standing. And she sat in the cold for 2 hours waiting. She had brought a thermos of coffee, which she drank slowly, sitting on the hood of a stranger's car and watching the stairwell. The timestamps in the camcorder footage, the birthday footage, the one with the figure in the doorway, she had worked it out down to the minute. She knew when. Her mother came out of the stairwell at 11:47 p.m. Renata was in a coat she didn't own yet in Mara's memory, which meant it was a new purchase, which meant Mara worked the timeline. She had maybe 6 weeks left. She was carrying a field case. She looked tired in the specific way of people who are working on something too big for one person, but are doing it anyway. Which was a specific kind of tired Mara recognized because she'd been wearing it herself for 11 months. She saw Mara and stopped. They looked at each other across 20 feet of concrete and bad fluorescent light. Mara had planned what she would say. She had a summary of the breakthrough formatted and bulleted. She had technical notes. She had a list of everything her mother needed to do differently to survive. Which roads not to take. Which buildings not to enter on which dates. She had assembled all of it in the careful way she assembled everything, with complete preparatory documentation, and she had it on a tablet in her coat pocket. She did not take it out. What she said instead was, "It works." Her mother's face changed. Not surprise. She had clearly suspected something like this was possible. But relief, the deep specific relief of someone who has been building in the dark, on faith alone, and has just been given a single point of light to aim at. "It works," Renata said. Not a question. It works, and they received it. The notebooks, someone got them, Mom. Someone used them. It mattered. Her mother set down the field case. She crossed the distance between them and put her hands on Mara's face in exactly the way she had done when Mara was small and frightened, which she had not done in many years because Mara was not small and generally did not permit frightened. And Mara felt something in her chest that had been compressed for 11 months, shift and release, like a spring-given room. "Tell me who," her mother said. So Mara told her. She told her about Dio and Petra and Tomas, about the workroom, about the bicycle with the scorch mark, about the shuttle and the shimmer, and the figure, standing still in the cabin's fluorescent hum. She told her about the envoy's question and the scientific personnel who had made the untranslatable sound. She told her about the ceasefire request, broadcast on all frequencies, which was not yet history, but would be. She did not tell her about the funeral, or about 11 months of grief kept at arm's length by work, because some information is meant to be received once and only once, in order. When she was done, her mother was quiet for a while. "The cascade problem," she said. "The stabilizer coupling on the third node. I've been modeling it wrong. I've been using a symmetric resonance assumption, but if the Vaechari architecture is asymmetric at the base level." "Notebook 12, Mara said. Page 44. You figure it out." Her mother laughed. It was exactly Tomas's laugh, or rather, Tomas's laugh was exactly hers, which was a thing Mara had not let herself notice for a year. "I need to go," Mara said. "If I stay too long, I know." Her mother stepped back, looked at her with the evaluating precision of a scientist, and the completely unscientific warmth of a mother. "You look tired." "I've been working." "Good." She picked up the field case. "Go home, sleep. You have a machine to finish." Mara went back. She came through the displacement in Dayo's living room, which was where they'd moved the apparatus when the workroom got too crowded, and she stood in the shimmer wash of re-entry with her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them. Dayo was asleep on the couch. Petra had left a mug of tea on the equipment table with a post-it note that said, "Next time, tell us you're going." Tomas was at the workbench, doing precise work with a calibration tool. And he looked up and met her eyes, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt in her chest, the specific human texture of grief becoming something that still hurt, but that you could finally carry without it carrying you. "How'd it go?" he said. She thought about her mother's hands on her face, about a woman in a new coat, working alone in the dark, on something too big for one person, and the particular stubbornness of choosing to keep going anyway, which was something they had apparently inherited. "Good," she said. It went good. She sat down at the workbench beside him and picked up a calibration tool of her own, and they worked together in the quiet, with the old music still playing low on the speaker in the corner. The open field voices, the festival joy, the sound of a species that had never stopped believing the next honest breath was worth taking. Outside, somewhere in a direction that wasn't quite spatial, a ceasefire was holding its breath. Inside, two people who had their mother's hands were doing the careful work. It was enough. It was, for now, exactly enough. The commission debriefing took 3 weeks. Admiral Chen, to his credit, was less interested in arresting anyone than in understanding what had happened. He sat through Mara's technical summary with the expression of a man who has been handed an answer to a question he hadn't known to ask, and is working through the implications in real time. The Vaechari verification of Renata's notebooks took longer. The alien scientists, working through the envoy's translation architecture, sent 17 clarifying questions over the course of 2 months, each one more specific than the last, each one making it clearer that they were not finding fault with the work, but were rather trying to integrate something that rewrote 2 centuries of their own assumptions. The ceasefire held through all of it. There were people on both sides who didn't want it to. There are always people like that. People whose identity has been built around the emergency, who don't know what they are without the shape of a crisis to fill. Mara understood them. She had been, in her quieter moments, a little bit one of them. Grief and anger are not so different in the way they organize a life. But the notebooks held. Patient accumulation of cross-verified proofs held. And the Vaechari scientific personnel published their integration. Published it, openly, across their own communication architecture, in a format their whole civilization could access. And the translation of their conclusion, rendered into human language by that system that was still developing vocabulary for concepts humanity hadn't needed before, came out as something like, the human researcher solved what we believed was unsolvable. She solved it alone. This requires us to reconsider what we believe. About alone, Petra framed that translation and hung it on the wall of what was now officially the Temporal Applications Research Group, operating under commission oversight with a budget and a mandate and a lot of very strong opinions about what they should do next. She put it next to a photograph of Renata at a whiteboard, pointing at an equation with the expression of someone who has just seen what the equation means. And is trying not to show how pleased she is. The first rule of the group was still Renata's first rule. We only go together. They added a second rule, which came from a long argument between Dio and Petra that Tomas finally settled by writing it on a whiteboard and refusing to erase it until everyone agreed. We tell each other where we're going. Mara didn't argue. She had already broken the first rule once, and she didn't regret it, and she would do it again, which was a thing she felt strongly and would never say aloud in an official setting. She went back to the birthday footage sometimes, late at night in the lab. The kitchen, the yellow wallpaper, small past self opening a present with both hands. And in the corner, the figure in the doorway, older, gray-templed, with lines at the corners of her eyes that she had earned by then. She had thought, when she first saw it, that she was looking at a ghost. She had been wrong about that. She was looking at evidence. She was looking at proof that the work would be finished, that the machine would be built, that someone would go back and say the thing that needed to be said. She was looking at herself. It was, in the end, the most Vaechari thing about the whole situation and also the most human. The future reaching backward to confirm that the past was worth continuing. A daughter traveling through the wound in time to tell her mother that what she built in the dark, alone, trusting precision and stubbornness and the refusal to stop, had been received, had mattered, would matter still. Mara closed the footage. She picked up calibration tool 7, which was hers, which she knew by the small scratch on the handle. She looked at the workbench covered in the careful evidence of people choosing to do hard things together. Then she got back to work. The Vaechari word for the ceasefire, it turned out, was not a political term. It was a philosophical one. Full rendering, when Dio's translation system finally found an approximation, came out as, the period in which we choose to assume the other is solving the same problem we are, and proceed accordingly. It had no exact human equivalent. Dio suggested grace, but thought that was too religious. Petra suggested good faith, but thought that was too legal. Tomas looked at the definition for a long time and then said, it just means trust. It means deciding to trust before you have proof. Mara thought about a woman in a new coat working alone in a basement, trusting that precision was its own kind of faith, trusting that the answer given before anyone was ready to receive it was still worth giving, still true, still mattering somewhere, downstream, in a direction she would never personally reach. She thought about a camera in a storage unit, a figure in a doorway, evidence. Yeah, she said, I think that's what it means.